The day my mother-in-law gifted me a vintage diary with a tiny, almost invisible camera lens embedded in the leather spine, I thought it was the most thoughtful present I had ever received. Even now, sitting in my quiet apartment with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, I can still feel the weight of that moment pressing down on my chest. My name is Olivia. I'm 29 years old, and I've been married to my husband, Daniel, for 3 years. What I'm about to write feels like confessing to a crime I didn't commit, or like I'm describing someone else's life entirely. But this is my life now, and I need to put the pieces down somewhere, even if just on paper, to make sense of the chaos that has consumed everything I thought I knew. Daniel and I met during our graduate studies at Columbia. He was pursuing his MBA while I was finishing my master's in social work. We were complete opposites in almost every way imaginable. He came from Manhattan elite money, the kind that has summer homes in the Hamptons and winter trips to Aspen. His family, the Whitmores, had been featured in society pages for decades. His mother, Victoria, was the undisputed queen of this particular universe, a woman who chaired charity galas the way generals command armies. I grew up in a modest suburban home in New Jersey. My father was a high school principal, my mother a librarian. We had enough, but we certainly didn't have the Whitmore kind of enough. From the very beginning, I felt like an outsider looking in at Daniel's world. The first time I attended a family dinner at their Upper East Side townhouse, I counted 7 different forks arranged around my plate and silently panicked, unsure which one to use for the salad. Victoria watched me with a polite, frozen smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I knew in that moment that I was being evaluated, measured against some invisible standard I couldn't possibly understand. For the first 2 years of our marriage, Victoria maintained a cool, distant politeness toward me. She was never openly rude, never said anything explicitly unkind, but there was always an undercurrent of something, a subtle dismissal that made me feel like I was perpetually auditioning for a role I would never get. She would ask about my work as a family therapist with pointed disinterest, her eyes glazing over as I explained my cases, always careful never to reveal identifying details about my clients. She would nod along, make vague comments about how noble my work was, and then promptly change the subject to something more relevant to her world, like the upcoming opera season or the renovations on their Connecticut estate. So when Victoria suddenly began taking an active interest in my life about 8 months ago, I was cautiously thrilled. She started calling me just to chat, something she had never done before. She invited me to lunch at elegant restaurants where the waiters knew her by name and the menus didn't list prices. She asked me questions, real questions, about my childhood, my parents, my dreams and fears. She wanted to know about the challenges I faced in my therapy practice, the emotional toll of working with troubled families, the cases that kept me up at night. Daniel was overjoyed. He had always hoped his mother and I would eventually connect, and he saw these lunches as the breakthrough we had been waiting for. "I told you she just needed time to get to know you," he said, kissing my forehead after I returned from one particularly long lunch where Victoria and I had talked for nearly 3 hours. "She's finally seeing what I saw in you from the beginning." And for a while, I believed it too. I started to look forward to our Thursday lunches with an almost childlike anticipation. Here was a sophisticated, powerful woman, and she wanted to spend time with me. She wanted to know my thoughts, my feelings, my experiences. She listened with what seemed like genuine interest, nodding thoughtfully, asking follow-up questions, remembering details I had mentioned weeks earlier. It felt like I was finally being welcomed into the inner circle, finally being seen as more than just a girl from New Jersey who had somehow married into the Whitmore dynasty. I opened up to her in ways I hadn't opened up to anyone, not even Daniel, about certain things. I told her about my own parents' difficult divorce when I was 16 and how it had shaped my decision to become a family therapist. I shared my insecurities about fitting into her world, the moment of imposter syndrome that still plagued me at family gatherings. I confided in her about a particularly challenging case involving a teenager who had attempted suicide, carefully omitting any identifying information but sharing the emotional weight of carrying those stories. I even told her funny anecdotes about Daniel, the charming, clumsy moments from our early dating days that she had never witnessed because he was always on his best behavior around his family. But then subtle cracks began to appear in this beautiful facade. The first one came about 3 months into our lunch tradition. Daniel mentioned something to me that I had only shared with Victoria the previous day, something about my mother's recent health scare. He said his mother had brought it up at a family dinner he attended without me, expressing such concern and asking detailed questions that he felt compelled to answer. The problem was, I hadn't told Daniel about my mother's health scare yet, because I wanted to wait until we had more information. Victoria had known before my own husband did. I let it slide, chalking it up to Victoria's genuine concern and my own failure to communicate with Daniel promptly. But it bothered me, a small splinter of discomfort that I couldn't quite remove. The second crack came a few weeks later at a Whitmore family gathering. Daniel's Aunt Eleanor pulled me aside with conspiratorial whisper. "Victoria tells me you're struggling with some difficult cases at work," she said, her voice dripping with full concern. "She mentioned you've been having nightmares about one particular teenager. That must be so hard for you." My blood ran cold. I had never told anyone about those nightmares. Not Daniel, not my own mother, not my closest friends. Only Victoria knew, because I had shared it during one of our lunches, describing how the weight of my client's trauma sometimes seeped into my dreams. Eleanor had no business knowing that. It was private, deeply personal, and Victoria had absolutely no right to share it. After the gathering, I confronted Victoria, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. I told her that I was uncomfortable with her sharing such personal details about my life, especially my work, with other family members. I explained that confidentiality was not just a professional obligation for me, but a personal value, and that I needed to feel safe that what I shared with her would remain between us. Victoria's response was masterful in its casual dismissal. She laughed lightly, patting my arm with her perfectly manicured hand. "Oh, darling, you're so serious," she said. "Eleanor is family. We don't keep secrets from family. Besides, I only share because I'm so proud of the important work you do. I want everyone to know what a remarkable daughter-in-law I have." What could I say to that? If I pushed further, I would look paranoid, overly sensitive, ungrateful for her pride in me. So I swallowed my discomfort and told myself I was overreacting. This is what families do, I thought. They share. They're close. I was the one with the boundary issues, not Victoria. The third crack was more like a seismic fracture. I was at a charity luncheon, one of those interminable events Victoria excelled at, when one of her closest friends, a woman named Penelope Weatherby, approached me with a smile that didn't quite hide the gleam of gossip in her eyes. "Victoria has the most wonderful way of telling stories about you," Penelope said, leaning in close. "The way she describes your therapy sessions, the things those poor, troubled children tell you. She makes it all so vivid, so dramatic. I feel like I know some of your cases personally." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What exactly has she told you?" I asked, my voice coming out strangled. Penelope waved her hand vaguely. "Oh, just little details here and there. The girl who cut herself, the boy who threatened to kill his stepfather. Victoria has such a gift for bringing stories to life. You must be so proud of the work you do." I made some excuse and fled to the restroom, where I stood shaking in a stall for a full 10 minutes. Victoria had been sharing details about my clients, not identifying information. Thank God I had been careful about that, but still, she had no right. These were real people Real children, real families dealing with unimaginable pain. And Victoria was using their stories as cocktail party entertainment. I should have confronted her then. I should have stopped the lunches. Stopped sharing, stopped trusting. But Victoria was so skilled at making me feel like the unreasonable one, like I was the one with the problem. When I brought it up carefully, she again dismissed my concerns with that practiced ease. Penelope exaggerates everything, she said. I might have mentioned in passing that your work is challenging, but I would never share anything inappropriate. You're being overly sensitive. Olivia, I think you need to examine why you're so quick to assume the worst of me. And because I was still desperate to believe that I had finally found a place in this family, because I still wanted so badly to have a real relationship with my mother-in-law, I let it go. Again. Then came the anniversary party. Daniel and I were celebrating 3 years of marriage, and Victoria insisted on hosting a grand celebration at the Whitmore Estate in Connecticut. It was going to be enormous, nearly 100 guests, including Daniel's law firm partners, old family friends, society columnists, and various Whitmore relatives I had only met in passing. Victoria had been planning it for months, consulting with caterers and florists and musicians with the precision of a military tactician. The day arrived, and despite my underlying unease about Victoria, I was genuinely excited. The estate looked magical, strung with fairy lights and overflowing with autumn flowers in deep burgundy and gold. Guests arrived in elegant attire, champagne flowed, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt like I truly belonged. I mingled comfortably, laughed at appropriate moments, and even received several compliments on a toast I gave about the beauty of building a life with someone who sees you completely. After dinner, Victoria stood up and clinked her glass with a silver spoon, commanding the room's attention with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this her entire life. I have a very special surprise for our beloved Daniel and Olivia, she announced, her smile warm and maternal. A little something to commemorate their beautiful journey together. The lights dimmed slightly, and a large screen descended from the ceiling at one end of the grand dining room. I assumed it would be a slideshow of wedding photos, perhaps some video from our honeymoon. I squeezed Daniel's hand under the table, feeling touched that Victoria had gone to such effort. Then my own voice filled the room. At first, I didn't recognize what I was hearing. It was fragments, snippets, pieces of conversation stitched together in a jarring, disjointed collage. But then the words began to register, and I felt the floor drop out from under me. I sometimes wonder if I'll ever truly fit into this family, my recorded voice said, and the room went silent. Victoria is so sophisticated, and I'm just me. I worry that Daniel will eventually realize he married beneath himself. Gasped from somewhere in the room. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Another clip. That case with a teenage boy who tried to hang himself. I dream about it almost every night. I wake up crying sometimes, and Daniel doesn't even know. I don't want to burden him with my work stress. And another, my parents' divorce destroyed me for years. I think that's why I became a therapist. To fix in others what I couldn't fix in myself. Sometimes I worry I'm more broken than the people I'm trying to help. The clips continued, a horrifying greatest hits collection of every vulnerable moment I had shared with Victoria over 8 months of Thursday lunches. But they were edited, twisted, taken out of context to create a narrative of instability, incompetence, and insecurity. My honest reflections about the challenges of my work were presented as evidence that I couldn't handle my job. My private fears about fitting in were presented as proof that I was deeply damaged. My funny stories about Daniel's quirks were twisted to make him sound ridiculous. I sat frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to even cry. Around me, I could see guests exchanging uncomfortable glances. Some whispered behind their hands. A few looked at me with what might have been pity or might have been judgment. I couldn't tell anymore. And Victoria sat at the head of the table, watching me with a serene smile, waiting for the moment when I would finally break. But then something happened that she hadn't anticipated. Daniel stood up so abruptly that his chair crashed to the floor behind him. His face was pale, almost gray, and his hands were shaking, but his voice when he spoke was ice cold and steady. "Stop the playback. Now!" A waiter scrambled to find the source, and the recording cut off mid-sentence, leaving an echoing silence in its wake. Daniel walked slowly to where his mother sat, and the look on his face was something I had never seen before in 3 years of marriage. It was a mixture of horror, rage, and something that looked almost like grief. "Mother," he said, his voice carrying to the silent room, "what you have just done is not only morally reprehensible, it's a crime. New York is a one-party consent state for recording, but that only applies if one party to the conversation knows about the recording. Olivia clearly had no idea. You've just publicly admitted to committing a felony." Victoria's smile flickered but held. "Don't be dramatic, Daniel. It was just a little joke, a way to share how wonderfully open and honest Olivia has been with me. Everyone thinks it's charming." "No one thinks it's charming," Daniel replied, "and you're about to find out exactly how not charming it is. I'll be filing a lawsuit against you personally first thing Monday morning. And I'll be recommending that my firm's entire client list reconsider their relationships with any business ventures connected to you." The room erupted into chaos after that. Guests began leaving in droves, some shooting Victoria looks of open disgust, others avoiding eye contact altogether as they fled. Victoria's husband, William, sat at the table looking utterly stricken, as if someone had just told him his entire life had been a lie. Victoria herself tried to laugh it off, to make jokes about how everyone was overreacting, but no one was listening anymore. Daniel took my hand and led me out of that house, through the garden still strung with fairy lights, past the valet who looked confused by the mass exodus of guests, and into our car. We drove home in complete silence, and when we finally reached our apartment, I collapsed on the floor of our entryway and sobbed for what felt like hours. That was 5 days ago. I've barely eaten, barely slept. Every time I close my eyes, I hear my own voice playing in that room, see the faces of strangers, hearing my most private thoughts. Daniel has been a fortress of support, handling everything, making calls, consulting with his firm's legal team, and shielding me from the worst of the fallout. But even his strength can't completely protect me from the devastation of what Victoria did. Yesterday, William showed up at our apartment unannounced. I had never seen him look anything less than impeccably composed, but this man who stood at our door looked old, tired, and deeply ashamed. He sat on our couch, twisted his wedding ring around his finger, and told us things that made the entire situation somehow even worse. Victoria had been doing this for years, he said. Decades, even. She had a habit of recording conversations, keeping files, collecting secrets like other people collect stamps or coins. He had known about it, vaguely, but had always told himself it was harmless. Just Victoria being Victoria. Just her way of staying connected to people. He had made excuses for her, smoothed things over when her manipulations came to light, paid off people when necessary, and pretended everything was normal. But this time was different. This time, he couldn't pretend anymore. He had watched the recording, heard the pain in my voice twisted into entertainment, and something in him had finally broken. He told us he was moving out, at least temporarily. He had given Victoria an ultimatum: get serious professional help or lose him completely. Then he told us something that made my skin crawl. Victoria had been recording Daniel for years, long before I ever entered the picture. She had recordings of his phone conversations from college, his private talks with friends, even snippets of therapy sessions he had during a difficult period in law school. She had been building a file on her own son since he was a teenager. Daniel went completely still beside me. "Therapy sessions?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. William nodded, looking miserable. during lockdown when you were doing phone sessions. She had some kind of recording device on the home line. I didn't know about it until recently. I swear, I found the files when I started going through computer. I reached for Daniel's hand and found it ice cold. The violation was so profound, so deeply wrong, that I couldn't even find words for it. Those therapy sessions were supposed to be sacred, a space where Daniel could work through his anxiety and stress without fear of judgment. And Victoria had been eavesdropping, collecting his vulnerabilities like trophies. But William wasn't done. He told us that since the party, other people had started coming forward, former friends, business associates, even distant relatives who had experienced Victoria's particular brand of manipulation over the years. Some of them had suspected they were being recorded, but could never prove it. Others had been blackmailed quietly, forced to comply with Victoria's wishes because she had something on them. The dam was breaking, and the flood of revelations was only beginning. After William left, Daniel and I sat in stunned silence for a long time. Then he started making calls. He contacted the district attorney's office, and after a lengthy conversation, it became clear that Victoria was facing far more than a civil lawsuit. What she had done crossed into criminal territory, especially with the therapy recordings. New York takes illegal wiretapping seriously, and Victoria had been doing it for years. Today, the first wave of legal action began. Daniel filed both a civil suit for invasion of privacy, emotional distress, and defamation, and a criminal complaint that the DA's office is now actively investigating. Victoria's lawyer, the one she hired after a previous firm mysteriously dropped her, has been making frantic calls trying to negotiate some kind of settlement. But Daniel isn't interested in settling. He wants his mother to face consequences, real consequences, for the first time in her life. I keep thinking about those 8 months of lunches, all those hours I spent opening my heart to someone I thought finally cared about me. I think about the way Victoria would lean in, eyes bright with interest, asking just the right questions to keep me talking. I think about how good it felt to be heard, to be seen, to finally feel like I belonged. And now I know that every moment of connection was actually a moment of data collection. Every vulnerable confession was ammunition stored away for future use. Every laugh we shared, every tear I shed in front of her, was just content for her files. The worst part is the self-doubt that creeps in during the quiet hours of the night. Was I naive to trust her? Should I have seen the signs earlier? Am I somehow responsible for giving her the material she used against me? Daniel keeps telling me no, that the only person responsible for Victoria's actions is Victoria herself. But the questions still haunt me. I think about the people she's hurt over the years, all those anonymous names William mentioned, the friends and associates and relatives who experienced the manipulations but never spoke up. I think about what it must have been like for them, carrying those violations silently while Victoria continued to move through the world untouched, unchallenged, always protected by her money and her position, and her husband's willingness to look the other way. And I think about Daniel, my husband, who grew up in that house, who probably has no idea how many of his private moments were recorded and filed away. He's handling all of this with such strength, such clarity, but I see the pain underneath. His own mother, the person who was supposed to protect him, was instead building a dossier on his most vulnerable moments. How do you recover from that? How do you ever feel safe again? William has officially filed for divorce. He called us yesterday to let us know, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, a kind of exhausted relief, like someone finally putting down a burden they've been carrying for decades. He's cooperating fully with the investigation, handing over everything he's found on the computer, answering every question honestly, doing whatever he can to make amends for all the years he enabled Victoria's behavior. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive him for those years of silence, but I understand why he did it. Living with someone like Victoria, you probably convince yourself that going along is easier than fighting, that keeping the peace is worth the cost, until one day you realize the cost has become everything. Tonight, Daniel and I are sitting on our balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settles over Manhattan. We haven't talked much, just sat together in the kind of silence that comes when words aren't enough. But at some point, he reached over and took my hand, and I felt something I hadn't felt in days. A tiny flicker of hope. This isn't over. There will be court dates and legal battles, and probably more revelations that will shake us to our core. Victoria isn't going to go quietly. She'll fight with every weapon she has. And she has many. But for the first time since that night in Connecticut, I believe we're going to be okay. Not because this will be easy, but because we're facing it together. Because the truth is finally coming out. Because the cycle of manipulation and control that Victoria built over decades is finally being dismantled one revelation at a time. I don't know what the future holds for us, for Daniel and me, for William, for all the other people Victoria hurt over the years. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust anyone again, or if the scars of this betrayal will fade with time. But I do know one thing with absolute certainty. I will never let Victoria Whitmore make me feel small again. I will never let her steal another moment of my peace. And when this is all over, when the legal battles are done and the dust is settled, I will walk forward into whatever comes next with my head held high, knowing that I survived the worst someone could do to me. And I'm still here, still standing, still whole. Victoria thought she was collecting secrets to use against me. But what she really did was show me exactly how strong I am. And that's something she can never take away.